Hello, economic students, and welcome back to online video learning macroeconomics. This video assumes that students have already watched and or read the chapter about and now understand the model known as aggregate supply aggregate demand. So the aggregate supply aggregate demand model, which will be reviewed briefly on the next few slides, is the model that economists use to make sense of the macroeconomy. What we're going to do now is build upon that model how the government can intervene when the U.S. economy is not achieving full employment domestic output. Much more about fiscal policy in a few moments, but that's the general idea. Okay, so quick review. The aggregate supply aggregate demand model, it is employed by economists to make sense of what's going on in the economy, the big picture of the macroeconomy. And by big picture, we mean the three most important variables: GDP, also known as output, unemployment, and inflation. So on the vertical axis, we're measuring inflation, or the general price level in the economy. We typically use the consumer price index to measure average price level in the economy. On the horizontal axis, we are simultaneously measuring real output, that is to say, GDP adjusted for change in the price level, GDP adjusted for inflation, and the level of unemployment. So as we move left to right along the horizontal axis, economic growth, economic output is increasing, unemployment is falling. All right. So as pictured on the board, we call this full employment domestic output, QF. See that down bottom there? This is the Goldilocks, everything's perfect in the world. The economy is growing at roughly 3%, our long run average rate of growth. Unemployment is somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.5%, and inflation is roughly 2%. Remember, this is the goal always. If everything was like this all the time, everything would be perfect, but the only thing is I'd be out of a job because we wouldn't really need the field of economics or macroeconomics, because there'd be no reason to ever study what to do when and if this is not the case. So remember, this is the goal. We want macroeconomic equilibrium, the intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, to happen or occur as pictured on this slide. But sometimes that is not the case. So let's look at a recession caused by a decrease in aggregate demand. Right? You can see here the aggregate demand curve has shifted well left of the level we identified on the previous slide as full employment domestic output. So Q2 means economic output, economic growth has been falling. So technically a recession is 6 months, 2 quarters or longer of GDP contraction. So if we as a nation are producing fewer goods and services in totality than we were in previous periods, what's going to happen with unemployment? As the economy falters, as the contraction worsens, the level of unemployment will rise, right? Now look what happened to price level. We don't say that the economy has deflation. We will have a significant amount of maybe disinflation. So inflation here is not a problem. We have an inflation measure at maybe roughly around 1%. So we went over in detail in the previous chapter what could cause a decrease in aggregate demand. When you see an economy that's in a recession, first and foremost think private sector. Consumer spending, consumer expenditures on durable goods is typically the culprit when you talk about a decrease in consumer spending, and a decrease in gross business investment. So consumer spending and business spending, that's the private sector of the economy. Typically, a recession is caused by a decrease in the level of spending by households/individuals on consumer expenditures, and a decline in gross business investments when companies, large and small, purchase machines, equipment, factories, tools, such on and such on. Now, we identified the particular events that would shift the curve to the left as far as consumer and investment is concerned. Make sure you review those if you don't remember those. Now, another issue that could affect the economy is what we refer to as demand pull inflation. Notice what is happening here with the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Macroeconomic equilibrium is where? Q1. Well, the level of real output is strong. Actually, the economy may be moving at too quickly a pace. What's happening here is GDP is growing at, say, 3.5%. Unemployment is 4% or lower. But the economy is at or near its capacity, maybe even beyond its capacity to produce. And we have the phenomenon known as demand pull inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. Right? Another way to express that is that spending is outpacing the economy's ability to keep up with production. So in this scenario, GDP is not a problem, growing at, as we said, 3.5%. Unemployment is not a problem, hovering at or below 4%. But inflation, price level, we could have inflation of 8 or 9%. So it's important to understand these three slides. Macroeconomic equilibrium at full employment domestic output, the first slide. All right. Equilibrium, which occurs during a recession, the second slide. And then demand pull inflation, this third slide. Because the purpose of studying fiscal policy is to determine what can the federal government do to alleviate economic pain caused by a recession and or to damper a recession damper inflation caused by demand pull inflation, right? So the whole purpose of this particular chapter is to say, now that we understand the basics of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, what happens when things are out of sync, when the economy is suffering recession or experiencing demand pull inflation? Is there anything the federal government can do to address the economic situation? Earlier in the macroeconomic course, we discussed the idea of the federal budget and the idea of what's called a balanced budget, a federal budget deficit, and a federal budget surplus. So it all boils down to the relationship between government expenditures, that is to say how much the federal government spends on social programs, military spending, research and development, right? The whole litany of what the government spends money on, and how much money the government collects in tax revenues from individual tax revenues, whether they are payroll tax, aka Social Security tax, good old-fashioned regular income taxes, and how much the government collects from corporations, corporate taxes. Now, there are a few other smaller ones known as an excise tax. But long story short, it's a simple idea. If in 1 year the government were to collect $4 trillion in tax revenues and spend exactly $4 trillion on social capital, military spending, healthcare, we would have a balanced budget. Now, that's obviously probably never going to happen where it's exact, but anything close to it, we would actually just call a balanced budget. However, unfortunately, most of the time, we have a situation where government expenditures exceed tax revenues. So if government expenditures are greater than tax revenues for that fiscal year, the government is running a federal budget deficit. There have been a few occurrences or instances of the situation known as a federal budget surplus, where the federal government actually collects more in tax revenues than it spends on the aforementioned expenditures, right? That happened in the late 1990s. Now, unfortunately, that came to a screeching halt, mostly because the dot-com era may have been misleading with some fictitious growth, right? So how about some numbers, because it's kind of important to put things in perspective. We will talk about these in absolute terms, and later on we will talk about them as a percentage of GDP. But last year, 2019, the federal budget deficit was nearly $1 trillion, right? And the largest federal budget deficit was in 2010 of $1.5 trillion. That large federal budget deficit was caused by the severe economic downturn of the 2008 financial collapse and housing boom bust, right? Now, this year, the prediction for the federal budget deficit was $1.1 trillion. So that was the prediction of the federal budget deficit prior to the pandemic known as coronavirus. The federal government just passed a $2 trillion stimulus package. So if we add the $2 trillion stimulus package that the federal government is going to institute and maneuver into policy to help rescue the economy, we add that to the assumed deficit for this year of $1.1 trillion. The United States could experience a federal budget deficit this year of over $3 trillion. So, in the long run, we look at all of the years that the federal government incurred a deficit. We subtract out the very few years the federal government actually achieved the federal budget surplus. We add those together and we come up with what's called the national debt. So you see there, it says the accumulation of deficits and surpluses over time, right? So obviously any increase in the deficits increases national debt, any surplus decreases national debt, right? Currently, the national debt of the United States is right around $22 trillion. We will review this U.S. debt clock in class, but I strongly suggest that on your own time, you visit this link, U.S. debt clock, and it shows you accurate numbers on federal budget deficits, federal expenditures, federal tax revenues, the source of tax revenues and expenditures. It also shows private sector debt. It shows student loan debt. It's a very useful link. All right, and the numbers are deemed to be accurate. So here's the national debt as a percentage of GDP, because it's always important to put things in perspective. In other words, you say, okay, well, if the national debt is $1 trillion, is that a lot or is that a little? If the national debt is $20 trillion, is that a lot or is it a little? Well, one will say barometer to measure the level of national debt, sort of using a common denominator here, is say, okay, as a percentage of their nation's output, as a percentage of GDP. So if you go back to 1940, you say, okay, prior to the war, the national debt of the United States was roughly 50%. It was roughly 50%. Of course, it skyrocketed during the war, right? Now, when you are at war with two nations, Germany and Japan, who desire to completely alter the way of life for every person existing on the planet, you throw caution to the wind, right? You say, okay, well, we have to run up these monumental deficits and pile on money to the debt because we have no other choice, right? Now, Roosevelt wasn't actually a big proponent of lowering taxes and increasing government spending. It kind of bothered him to do this to help the economy get out of the Great Depression. But, everybody knew it. There was no other choice but to throw caution to the wind and spend on military production in an effort to win the war. So notice that during the war, the national debt as a percentage of GDP soared to 120%, right? So think of it in these terms. If, I'll just use easy numbers. If the GDP of the United States was $100 billion in 1945, The national debt at that moment was $120 billion, right? 120% of GDP. Notice how the national debt as a percentage of GDP fell substantially through all of the administrations that followed the war, all the way up to and including Ronald Reagan. So you look and say, man, when Reagan took office, the national debt began to rise significantly. So why was this the case? All right, well, there's probably three contributing factors. Number one is that Reagan inherited a pretty weak economy, and the economy got worse in 1982, late 1981, 1982. So we weren't collecting as much in tax revenues. But the larger two contributing factors was the idea that Reagan slashed taxes, which ended up generating a significant amount of economic growth later in his second term as president, really the second half of his first term and the entire second term. But the big factor that contributed to a significant increase in the national debt during the Reagan years was increased military spending. Reagan gambled it would be wise for the United States to try to outspend the Soviet Union to bankrupt the Soviet Union. All right. We'll say that sources suggested that the Soviets were in dire economic consequences because the money they spent on the Afghan war and the socialism not working out to be, as we'll say, as efficient as would have otherwise liked it to be, right? So his idea was if the United States spends on military production and the Soviets try to keep pace, they'll bankrupt their own nation. And that's exactly what happened. So it was a cost to pay, right? There's the idea that there's always a cost in terms of economics. Notice that during the Clinton years, the debt as a percentage of GDP started to fall. Things were getting better. The 90s were an extremely good economic time for the United States. And then you see here it says the debt as a percentage of GDP started to rise. And it rose a lot during Barack Obama's presidency, mostly because he inherited an economy which was a disaster. It had gone like, stagnant. It was just in dire straits. So this is a more recent, this is from 1947 through 2019. We'll look at a more recent picture down the road here. This just shows you federal government surplus and or deficit as a percentage of GDP over that time. Notice the very few years we had a surplus, right? Not many years we had a surplus. Most of the time we had a deficit, right? And you can see that after the 2008 recession, how much the deficit grew as a percentage of GDP because of the financial collapse and the housing bust that created the worst recession since the Great Depression. This shows you average federal budget deficit as a percentage of GDP by administration, right? So if you look at the difference between Carter and Reagan, right? When Jimmy Carter was president, deficits averaged only 2.4% of GDP. Just spoke about Reagan and the military spending that Reagan introduced to the United States budget. Notice it significantly increased the deficit as a percentage of GDP. You look at this and you see, oh man, Barack Obama must have done a poor job. He wasn't fiscally responsible. But remember, Barack Obama inherited an economy which was in just absolutely atrocious shape in 2009 when he took office. And it was necessary for the government to undertake some significant fiscal stimulus to help alleviate the economic pain suffered by millions of Americans. And it was for this reason that as a percentage of GDP, the Obama administration looks like it gets sort of a bad name. This is the same idea here. This is the level of public debt as a percentage of GDP for each president. Right? Notice Bush the second, right? His last year really spiked up there. That was because he was commander-in-chief right as the financial crisis was causing the recession. Right? This slide shows us change in debt from taking office to leaving office. And you look and say, well, during Clinton's era, it actually went down, all right, which, is a reflection of the strong economy of the 90s. And then you say, man, Bush, the son, Jr., and Barack Obama must have been fiscally irresponsible. But it's one of those economic examples that you must investigate further before laying too much blame on one individual. Remember, Bush was president during 9/11, which happened 8 months into his presidency or 9 months into his presidency. The United States spent $1.5 trillion on 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a significant amount of expenditures on homeland security. That's one reason why the debt increased significantly between the time Bush took office and when he left. The other reason is because he was the president when the Great Recession of 2007 started. Barack Obama, you can say that the entire rationale or reason why there was a significant increase in debt from the time he took office to the time he left all had to do with bad timing. He just inherited an economy which was in abysmal shape and was getting much better when he left office. So, we are going to talk about fiscal policy. John Maynard Keynes was the first economist to suggest that capitalism in and of itself is a good theory, but laissez-faire capitalism, that is to say, market-based system with little to no government intervention in the economy, has some problems or presents some issues. John Maynard Keynes pointed out during the Great Depression that when private sector spending falters, consumer spending and investment spending, the only institution on earth capable of filling the spending gap is the government. So, Great Depression, worst decade of existence in our great nation. We suffered through the war. Thankfully, we won the war, and then we had to put the economy back together. Briefly after the war, 1946, federal government passed the Employment Act. Right? The Employment Act of 1946. It established the Council of Economic Advisors, women and men who were commissioned to keep the president abreast of all information related to the economy and every development which could affect GDP, unemployment, and inflation. Also established a joint economic committee. Think of the Employment Act of 1946 as a promise, a guarantee made by the federal government that it will do everything in its power to keep the U.S. economy from ever experiencing the economic woes and pains and significant drop in standard of living that happened during the Great Depression. So, interesting time to be studying this particular chapter. The coronavirus has made governments around the world responsible to keep their economic engine afloat until we can start the engine back up. It's a very difficult time. This is March 31st, almost soon to be April 1st, 2020. We are at the height of this pandemic, hoping it's not getting worse. But economies around the world, governments around the world, already using this same rationale to rescue their economies. So this chapter, as mentioned before, is studying what is known as, referred to as fiscal policy. Fiscal policy. So let's look at the definition and then analyze this, because anyone can read it, but understanding it is far more important. Changes in government spending and or taxes, goal of shifting aggregate demand. So let's take this piece by piece. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. One of the most important concepts related to the economics perspective. Economic thinking is marginal thinking. Most decisions involve changes in the status quo. Remember, society is broken into three particular categories: individuals slash households, businesses, and government. These three components. The economic principle of marginal thinking applies equally to all three components. So when we talk about this idea of changes in government spending and or taxes, know that there's always a level of government spending taking place in the economy. In 2019, the federal government spent roughly $4 trillion. $4 trillion. What did the federal government spend money on? Well, Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, research and development for scientific exploration, infrastructure spending on roads and bridges and schools, education, military spending, and finally the government spent a decent amount of money, maybe like 9% of the budget, financing previous debt that's been incurred. All right, so roughly $4 trillion was spent by the federal government in 2019. Likewise, the government always collects a certain level of taxes. So in 2019, the government collected roughly $3 trillion in taxes. That's a combination of mostly corporate taxes and then personal income taxes and Social Security or payroll taxes, right? So when we look at this term or this definition, the understanding of fiscal policy, the key idea here is changes. So when we are studying fiscal policy, we are referring to discretionary fiscal policy. That's an important idea, which means the government changes laws which literally change the level of either government spending in the economy and or the level of taxation in the economy. So the House and the Senate, Congress introduces a law and the president signs the law and therefore it becomes new legislation, and that law either changes the level of government spending taking place and or the level of taxes. We say and or because it could address both taxes and spending. Now, the last part of the definition is extremely important as well. When we use the term fiscal policy, we are referring to the federal government attempting to influence what's taking place or what's happening in the economy. So in the previous chapter, and as reviewed on the previous slides in this lecture, we identified macroeconomic equilibrium, which displays a recession, and or macroeconomic equilibrium, which could be happening when we're experiencing demand pull inflation. So when we study fiscal policy, it is important to remember that fiscal policy is aimed at influencing aggregate demand. It says the goal of shifting aggregate demand. Many students miss this point and then therefore don't really understand fiscal policy moving forward. So think of it in these terms. If the economy is achieving macroeconomic equilibrium at full employment domestic output, in other words, if economic growth is 3% or thereabouts, unemployment is about 4.5% or thereabouts, and inflation is about 2%, there's no need to change government spending or tax levels in the economy, or that's what most economists believe. There's no need to lower or increase taxes. There's no need to increase or decrease the level of government spending, right? So fiscal policy, Keynesian idea, what can the government do when macroeconomic equilibrium is not happening or occurring near or close to full employment domestic output? So now we understand the idea of fiscal policy. The federal government can change the level of government spending and or the level of taxation to impact or affect the current economic situation taking place in the good old US of A. So let's assume that aggregate demand has shifted well left as pictured on the slide we are looking at currently. So Q2, the level of GDP at this current level of macroeconomic equilibrium is well below full employment level of GDP. So GDP is falling, right? Relative to last quarter, the last half a year or longer, we have GDP negative in negative terms. So we would say GDP is falling maybe at a rate of, say, 3.5, 3.6%, a pretty severe recession. With GDP falling relative to previous recent economic history, unemployment is rising. Notice P2, inflation is not an issue. Inflation is not a problem. So whenever you are asked to analyze the current economic situation using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model as pictured here, first look and say, okay, where's aggregate demand, the green curve intersecting with the upward sloping red aggregate supply curve, and then determine what's going on with GDP, unemployment, and inflation. And then you understand the current situation as far as the business cycle. So we are in a recession. This is a picture of a recession. Now, how we got there, that's a really good question. In 2008, we had the financial banking collapse and we had the housing collapse. In 2020, we've voluntarily turned off the economy to combat COVID-19, and we've asked businesses to shut down, and we're all practicing this quarantining. So there's been a significant drop in aggregate demand. Think about the gross business investment fell off the chart. None of it taking place right now. Consumer spending dropping significantly. So now that we understand what's going on with the economy, the question is, what can the federal government do to address the current economic situation? If the economy is in a recession, fiscal policy option to alleviate the economic hardship and downturn is referred to as expansionary fiscal policy. So in the previous slide, we identified GDP weak, unemployment rising, say 10, 12%, no upward pressure on prices because there's a lot of excess capacity in the economy. Businesses aren't bidding up the price of resources, consumers aren't spending. So what can the government do to alleviate the current economic hardship? Remember, fiscal policy is aimed at aggregate demand, influencing aggregate demand, right? So the government has a few choices. 1, increase government spending. 2, some tax cuts on individuals, could be corporate, but on individual tax cuts. And most likely, we're going to have some combination of option 1 and option 2, right? So let's see how this would work in theory. Expansionary fiscal policy aimed at alleviating the pain and hardship caused by a recession. Aggregate demand decreased. We have significant less economic activity taking place than we desire. What if the government steps in and says, look, the current situation with AD2, AS, not acceptable. Let's try an increase in government spending. Let's use fiscal stimulus. Let's deploy expansionary fiscal policy aimed at increasing aggregate demand to catapult the economy back towards its potential economic outputs. So the government spends $5 billion. Now, a good question might say, okay, well, what does the government spend money on? Obviously, Washington, D.C., you have Democrats, you have Republicans. We will talk later about some of the criticisms of fiscal policy. But for the moment, let's just agree to disagree to get along and say the government spends all $5 billion on infrastructure spending, roads and bridges and such. Remember that if the government puts $1 into the economy, the Keynesian multiplier, the idea of this is not the beginning and the end of the story, this is only the beginning of the impact on total economic output. So 5 billion times a multiplied effect, we get a total increase in GDP of 20 billion. Now you might say, well, how the heck did you know that the $5 billion increase in government spending aimed at shifting aggregate demand to the right, increasing aggregate demand, would ultimately create $20 billion worth of an increase in GDP? This is an example from the textbook. In the textbook, it tells you the economy under consideration has a marginal propensity to consume of 0.75, therefore a marginal propensity to save of 0.25. If that's the case, right, if MPC is 0.75, MPS is 0.25, 1 over 1 minus 0.75 or 1 over 0.25 gives you a multiplier value of 4. 4 multiplier times initial change in spending, 5, gives us a total increase in GDP of $20 billion. So you get the idea here, right? Is that, okay, the economy was in a recession, aggregate demand is weak, private sector spending, consumer spending, and gross business investment falling. People are unemployed. They don't have money to spend. They're not spending money. Businesses aren't finding any projects where the expected rate of return is greater than the real rate of interest because there's not much demand for the goods they're producing or the services they're providing. With private sector spending falling, the government steps in to hopefully increase aggregate demand, shifts aggregate demand to the right. Now, what about the other option? What if the government decides, you know what, we're not going to increase government spending. What we would like to do is we would like to cut taxes. Remember, that's one of the other expansionary fiscal policy options. So assume for the moment that the federal government, the House and the Senate, is predominantly Republicans. Republicans typically favor tax cuts over increases in government spending. And they say, well, we don't want to spend government money. Let's give money back to taxpayers. All right, well, what's the problem with that approach? Right? What is the problem with that particular approach to fiscal stimulus? Well, if you remember from our previous discussion, if I receive a tax cut and I'm like the average person, I'm going to spend only 75% of my tax cuts because the marginal propensity to consume in this economy is 0.75. Now, there will be Frugal Frank and Sally Saver, and they won't spend any of their tax cuts. But then there'll be, Joe who spends all of it, and Mary who spends every cent. But marginal propensity to consume tells us what the average person does. So when it's all said and done, if, just going to make up a nice round number here, if 100 million working Americans receive a tax cut, on average they will spend 75% of their additional or change in income. The reason why this math is important is because it tells us any tax cut would have to be larger than any increase in government spending because some of the tax break is going to be saved. Now, the book tells you these numbers. If the government were to cut taxes by exactly 6.67 billion, and on average people spent 75% of that, 5 billion would ultimately make its way back in the economy. So the government cuts taxes by 6.67 billion. 75% of that is spent. 75% of 6.67 is 5. A $5 billion increase in spending initially ultimately has a multiplied effect of the exact same measure, $20 billion increase. Now remember, when we started this little explanation, we identified the idea that most of the time there's compromise between tax cuts and government spending. We're going to get some of both, which is good because we'll say it's a political compromise on a solution. But it's bad for us as economic students because the math becomes complicated, right? What if the government spends $3 billion? How much of a tax cut do we need to get to the $5 billion, right? Don't worry about the math, okay? Don't worry about the math. Just know this important idea. If the government chooses tax cuts over government spending, any tax cuts would have to be larger than government spending because some of the money will be saved. Now, this is an extremely important idea. Assume the economy, the federal budget was balanced to begin with. Assume that at the time of the economic downturn, government spending equaled tax revenues at the federal level. Okay, what happens to the federal budget if the federal government cuts taxes and or increases government spending? Any expansionary fiscal stimulus will ultimately cause a federal budget deficit because the government is changing the law to collect less taxes and or increase government spending, which means that the federal government will now incur a federal budget deficit. If, as most of the time is the case in the real world, the federal government was already running a federal budget deficit, this will add to the size of the deficit. One final question. Which approach is better? Now, one of the interesting things about teaching economics, normative economics. You can tell an economist, but you can't tell them much. That's why we have democratically elected officials and we have Republican officials. Some people are huge proponents of government spending and think the government does a better job of assisting the economy when things are out of sorts, or just in general, they think government spending is good. Other people believe that putting money in the hands of people who are working is a much more efficient tool. The math suggests that an increase in government spending is more efficient because every dollar ultimately makes its way into the economy. That's the math. The reality, as we know, that's not the case. When you look at big government infrastructure projects, today we don't have the luxury of what happened during the Hoover administration. During the Roosevelt administration. The Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression spent money on something like the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam came in under budget and ahead of time. Unfortunately, the reality of the public sector is far different today. If you look at a project such as the Big Dig in Boston, the Big Dig was an infrastructure project funded by federal money. $5 billion was the estimate, and the purpose of the project was to build a highway underneath the existing city infrastructure to alleviate congestion in that specific section of the urban setting. The project ultimately cost $50 billion, not $5 billion. There was all sorts of, unfortunately, fraud involved with the project where businesses were milking the government for money. And then 6 or 8 years after the project was completed, the actual construction collapsed and people lost their lives. So this is an extreme example, but it makes an important point. Government spending is not always efficient. There's also an argument that tax cuts lead to allocative efficiency. In simplest terms, allocative efficiency refers to what? The combination of output or the production of goods and services which maximizes utility of all citizens under consideration. What would you rather have for Christmas? Your friend or your parents buy you a gift or somebody give you $100 in cash? The reason why cash is the best gift is because you know for your own utility what is the best way you could spend $100. Right? So the argument can be made that putting money in the hands of individuals and families ultimately results in the most efficient outcome because people will frequent the stores and buy the goods and services that maximize their utility. So a quick review of the difference between using government spending versus tax cuts as the tool for expansionary fiscal policy. An increase in government spending will immediately increase aggregate demand because Aggregate demand is made up of consumer spending, business investment on machines, equipment, and tools and factories and such, government spending and net exports. So government spending automatically increases aggregate demand because G will increase. And then there should be a multiplied effect. As the government spends money, ultimately it should increase consumer spending. Might actually increase investment spending as well. If the government decides to use the tax cut approach, decreases in taxes does what? Okay, all of a sudden, individuals and households have more disposable income. So there's definitely going to be an increase in consumer spending, right? Increase in after-tax profits cause more investment to be profitable. So if you think about businesses, we cut business taxes, their profits increase, which means, hey, they have more money to spend. It means that they're going to find maybe more investments where the expected rate of return is greater than the real rate of interest. Interesting thing about tax cuts is that they could have also a positive impact on exports because decreasing taxes should, in theory, reduce the cost of goods to foreigners or exports, which means exports could rise. So normally we have an approach taken by the government where they have some of the tax cuts and the government spending, but these two slides at least outline the effects of each policy, whether it be decreasing taxes or increasing government spending. Our macroeconomic model of aggregate supply, aggregate demand helps us make sense of the current state of equilibrium in the economy, macroeconomic equilibrium. Let's see what's going on with the economy now. We have a significant increase, rightward shift of aggregate demand. So let's assume the graph that we're looking at presently represents the current state of the economy. Okay, what phase of the business cycle are we now experiencing? This, my friends, is what we call demand pull inflation. Notice that the significant rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve is well past full employment domestic output. So at Q1, what's happening? Well, economic growth is not a problem. Matter of fact, the economy is growing too fast, which sounds counterintuitive, right? Like, how could that happen? Right? Now, remember, in the short run, we have limited economic resources, land, capital, labor, unlimited economic desires or wants. So if aggregate demand starts to outpace the economy's ability to keep up with production, we could have this situation called demand pull inflation. So at Q1, GDP is not a problem. Likewise, unemployment is not a problem. Unemployment is definitely below the natural rate of unemployment of 4.5%. In this case, you have unemployment down by 3.6, 3.2%. But look at P1, price level. That's the issue. You have inflation much higher than 2% average increase in CPI, which is acceptable. So you have an increase in the average price level or inflation far greater than which is acceptable by any standards. The question then becomes, what type of fiscal policy options are available for the government, the federal government, to address demand pull inflation? The answer is, all right, contractionary fiscal policy. Now remember, discretionary fiscal policy refers to when the government actively changes the level of taxation and or spending, and we already covered expansionary fiscal policy. Now we're covering contractionary fiscal policy. These are both examples of discretionary fiscal policy, meaning the government creates a new law to change the level of spending or taxation in the economy. So if the economy is experiencing demand pull inflation, the government will pass a law, they will institute discretionary fiscal policy, and it's called a contractionary fiscal policy aimed at decreasing government spending or increasing taxes, right? So if we think about what's going on in the previous slide, say, okay, aggregate demand is excessive, too much money chasing too few goods. Inflation is 6, 7, 8%, right? There's the issue. The spending is outpacing the economy's ability to produce. How can the government get aggregate demand back to an acceptable level? Well, the government could cut government spending. The government could increase taxes, or the government can use some combination of the both. Those are the contractionary fiscal policy options that the government could institute. Let's look at this graphically, right? Here we see that aggregate demand has shifted to the right at AD4. If the government cuts spending by 5 billion, and there is still a multiplier of 4, ultimately aggregate demand would decrease by $20 billion, right? So cut government spending by 5 billion, multiplied effect on the economy, and you have a decrease in aggregate demand all the way down to 83, and you bring inflation back in check. Now, if you look up there, it says recessions decrease aggregate demand, right? Here's the issue, right? We don't want to put the economy into recession involuntarily, right? Now, the other option is the government could increase taxes, right? Now, a couple things about contractionary fiscal policy. Number one, inflation has not been a serious economic issue since the 80s, the early 80s, right? So we really haven't worried about inflation all that much lately, right? That's the first thing to identify. Usually we're worried about economic downturns and how to recover from economic downturns. Issue number two, when we think about the federal government policy options to address demand pull inflation, you could increase taxes, we could cut government spending, or use some combination of the both. So, have you ever heard a politician, or do you ever think you will hear a politician state that they are going to increase taxes on individuals? It's just not a popular modus operandi for politicians. Now, maybe you hear politicians say, well, we're going to increase taxes on the wealthy. Well, in 2018, the highest 20% of income earners paid 87% of personal income taxes. So the wealthy already pay a lot in taxes. Just not a popular policy. The other option, what about cutting government spending? Well, politicians who get elected, they may run on the premise that they're going to cut government spending, but then they get to office and they realize every politician is pretty much in the same boat. No one wants to cut programs in their district because it'll be wildly unpopular and it would cost them votes. Their constituents would not be happy. So, in theory, contractionary fiscal policy options would work, right? Cutting government spending and or increasing taxes, some combination, to address demand pull inflation. In reality, first, we do not experience demand pull inflation, or at least we haven't experienced it all that much over the course of the last 4 decades, 3.5 decades. Plus, the federal government options to address demand pull inflation, the contractionary fiscal options, are not politically popular. So even though we discussed the unpopular notion of contractionary fiscal policy, let's theoretically at least discuss how it would work. So if the government were to cut government spending, automatically there would be a decrease in aggregate demand because obviously government spending is part of C plus I plus G plus X. If the government cuts spending, ultimately that would have a multiplied effect and it would cut some of consumption expenditures when the government takes spending out of the economy. Think about how a decrease in, say, government expenditures on infrastructure projects ultimately decreases income for consumers, which creates a multiplied effect. The other option, increase in taxes. Obviously, if the government increases taxes, there'll be less consumer spending, right? So, because individuals will have less disposable income. Increasing taxes also decreases profits for businesses, right? Which means fewer investments would be profitable. And the other interesting thing is that if the government increases taxes, it would increase the exports, the cost of goods to people living outside the United States, and exports would drop. There is a concept known as built-in stability. built-in stabilizers, right? And the idea is when we look at government expenditures and tax revenues over the course of the business cycle, that there is some automatic, the idea of built-in, automatic adjustments to the level of government expenditures and taxes collected over the course of the business cycle. So the first point out here says that net tax revenues vary directly with GDP. Let's think about government tax collection during various phases of the business cycle. During an economic expansion, labor force participation is high. People are working, they're paying personal income taxes. Corporations are producing goods and services, they're paying corporate taxes. The quicker or the more, let's say, a strong economic growth the economy experiences, the stronger the economic growth, the more tax revenues the government will collect. Recessions have the opposite effect on tax collections. People lose their jobs, fewer people are working, fewer people are paying personal income tax. Corporations experiencing less demand for their goods and or services are paying less in corporate taxes because they're selling fewer goods and services and therefore not paying as much taxes. Therefore, net tax revenues vary directly with GDP, the amount of economic activity which takes place. Transfer payments. Remember, a transfer payment is things like unemployment checks, right? They behave the opposite way as tax collections, right? So, if the economy goes into recession, let's think about what type of automatic or built-in stabilizers kick into place without passing a new law. What type of transfer payments automatically increase? All right, we are in the midst of one of the scariest, if not the scariest, economic downturns in the history of the modern economy. COVID-19 forced global economies to hit the pause button on economic production. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, so it is now early April 2020, 10 million Americans have filed for unemployment. So the economy is going into recession, right? No one had to pass a law to increase these transfer payments so that government spending would increase. Unemployment benefits are a rule or a law already on the books. So as soon as the economy went into recession, 10 million people filed for unemployment. So there you go. Transfer payments go up at the same time GDP is going down. If the economy is experiencing much stronger economic growth, unemployment will continue to fall. With lower rates of unemployment, obviously, the government will be responsible to pay fewer unemployment benefits. GDP rising, transfer payments falling, right? So that's the idea of built-in stabilizers. Now, what's the economic importance of built-in stabilizers? Two ideas here. One is that if we have built-in stabilizers, we have a cushion built into the system that automatically responds if and when things get bad, right? The other idea is simply a numbers game and say, okay, to some degree, we don't have to worry about the federal government acting and when and if the economy gets off kilter. The purpose of this graph is to explain how built-in stabilizers work and or the beauty of built-in stabilizers. Important for students to recognize what we are talking about prior to moving forward. Remember, discretionary fiscal policy refers to the government, the House and the Senate, Congress, introducing a law, the president signing it into law, and active changes to the level of government spending and or the level of taxes. Built-in stabilization is analyzing what would happen if we do nothing. How do government tax revenues and expenditures automatically change by built-in stabilizers. Right? How does the system automatically adjust? So on the vertical axis, we're measuring government expenditures and tax revenues. That's the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we're simply measuring the level of real output. Look at GDP2 first. What's happening there? Notice that tax revenues equal government spending. That means we have a balanced budget, right? A balanced budget. Now, it's important to identify that throughout this time, government expenditures don't change. Remember, what we're saying here is, what if we don't pass a law to address the economic worries or concerns of the economy? Well, if we don't pass a law, the level of government expenditures will not change over time. That's why the G curve is perfectly horizontal. The tax curve, T, that straight line, right, that downward sloping, or I should say upward sloping line, what is that telling us? Notice that during a recession, which is GDP 1, the government will collect less tax revenues. Fewer people are working, right? Fewer goods and services are being produced and sold, so personal income taxes fall, corporate income taxes fall. Of course, if the federal government is collecting fewer personal income taxes or fewer revenues of personal income tax, fewer corporate taxes, and government spending doesn't change, the federal government will run a federal budget deficit. That's exactly what we would want to occur, right? If the economy is in a recession, we want spending to outpace tax revenues. Because tax revenues automatically fall during a recession, we automatically run a deficit. Likewise, if we are experiencing demand pull inflation at GDP 3, unemployment is significantly below the natural rate of unemployment. Right? So we have unemployment of 3.25% or something in that nature. Right? GDP is strong. When the economy is cooking along at such a strong pace of growth, say close to 4% growth, there are very few people collecting unemployment benefits, right? Most people are working and they're paying more, so the government's collecting more taxes. Likewise, corporations are producing and selling goods at the fastest pace they possibly can, so corporate taxes also increase. So notice that if the economy is experiencing demand pull inflation, automatically the federal government runs a federal budget deficit, federal budget surplus. Now, a good question then is, okay, if this is the case, why do we ever need discretionary fiscal policy? If the government automatically runs some of a deficit during recessions and automatically incurs a federal budget surplus during demand pull inflation, why do we ever need to pass legislation to address economic downturns, a severe recession, or pass some type of legislation which cuts spending and increases taxes to address demand pull inflation? Here's the answer. Think about a built-in stabilizer for another type of application. Think about what happens in a home that has fire or smoke detectors and sprinklers, right? If the outbreak is manageable, the system works and everything is good. However, if there is a fire in the neighborhood and blazes are hitting the roof and the sides of the home from both sides, it's going to overwhelm the built-in stabilizing system. Another analogy might be something like the levees or a dike, something like what happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, where the levees were built to sustain a certain level of increase in water, but when the flood levels rose above the built-in stabilizers, it created a catastrophe. So think of built-in stabilizers in the economy to the same degree. They work to some extent, but when there's a severe problem, we need discretionary fiscal stimulus, or we need government to address demand pull inflation. Now, one thing about built-in stabilizers is that if we so desired, we can make the built-in stabilization system a bit stronger, right? So the more progressive your tax system, the more built-in stability you have in the system. So we think about the average level of tax collection, right? So we do tax collection, total tax collection over GDP. A progressive tax system means as GDP increases, so does the average rate of tax collection. A proportional tax system means that if GDP increases or decreases, the average rate stays the same. Regressive is the opposite. So if we increased marginal tax rates, there would be more built-in stabilization in the economy. But remember, everything in economics has a cost. Higher progressive tax system, which would definitely increase the level of built-in stability, would also slow economic growth over longer periods of time. So it's a trade-off. If we trace the history of the federal budget from 1800 all the way through to 2020, we notice a disturbing trend. In most years, the U.S. federal government runs a federal budget deficit. That is to say, federal government expenditures exceed tax revenues. There have been a few years where federal tax revenues exceeded government expenditures. So if we add up all of the years, which is most of them, where the federal government ran a deficit, and we subtract out the few surpluses, we add those together and it comes out to a number, and that is called our nation's national debt. The nation's national debt, April 2020, is roughly $23.8 trillion, right? So the United States is in debt $23.8 trillion, right? So let's take last year, 2019, and talk about what happened. In 2019, federal government expenditures were roughly $4 trillion. Federal government expenditures were roughly $4 trillion. Federal government tax revenues were roughly $3 trillion. So that meant for 2019, the federal government ran a budget deficit of $1 trillion. Well, how does the government finance the federal budget deficit? The federal government borrows money. They issues debt in the form of bonds. What is this chart on our screen? This shows you, okay, who has bought those bonds over time? Who owns the public debt that we have incurred as a nation over our existence as a country, right? So, who owns the national debt of the United States? Now notice, the pie chart is broken into, when you talk about the overall public debt, who in the public owns it versus what government agencies own it. So let's look first at the yellowish and orangish, we'll call those pie pieces, right? 15% is owned by the Federal Reserve, 26% by U.S. government agencies. So we have, when we add these together, 26 plus 15 comes out to 41%. 41% of government debt is actually owned by government itself, right? Government institutions. So it's interesting that, 41% of our national debt is sort of owned by government institutions themselves. If you want to get really technical, the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, which owns 15% of the debt, is not really a part of the federal government. Our nation's central bank is independent of the federal government, right? We just sort of lump them in there for convenience. It's sort of an interesting, complicated quasi-existence that the Federal Reserve has. But they're close enough so we can lump them together and say, okay, between the Federal Reserve and the federal government, they own 41% of our national debt. So the rest of it is what we say held by the public, right? Debt held by outside of government agencies. So of that, 11% is held by state and local governments, 10% by financial institutions and banks, 4% by good old American citizens, and then 34% of the debt is owned by foreign countries or foreign individuals. So it could be foreign countries or it could be foreign corporations and individuals. That portion of the debt has grown significantly over time, right? And China, Japan own large swaths of that 34%. Now we know who owns the U.S. debt, so we understand sort of the structure of our nation's national debt. What's the next logical question to ask? $23.8 trillion. Is that a problem? Well, quick story. My good friend Jim Murray was the general manager of the Philadelphia Eagles when Leonard Toews was the owner. And Leonard, unfortunately, had a bit of a gambling problem. And he went to the bank and he borrowed $60 million against the value of the team. My good friend Murray was walking back out to the car with Leonard. And Murray said to Leonard, Leonard, I'm a little bit worried. And Leonard said, Murray, what are you worried about? He said, well, we just borrowed $60 million, right? And Leonard Toews had a classic answer. He goes, Murray, you borrow $6 million, you got a problem. You borrow $60 million, the bank has a problem. So it's an interesting way to look at it, right? So it's a really good question. Is this a problem? Is this enormous amount of debt a major problem for the United States? And here's why we are really worried. We're in the middle of COVID-19 economic collapse, voluntarily shutting off our economy. That's happening right now. The federal government of the United States has already passed a $2 trillion fiscal stimulus, which means the national debt's going to increase by $2 trillion. It may only be round one. We may need to stimulate the economy further. We might be looking at another $2 trillion in debt added on to our national debt because of this economic downturn. So it's a really good question. When is too much? When is enough enough? And at the moment, after watching several analysts on CNBC and doing some independent reading, the consensus among economists is that the debt is still manageable. Put things in perspective. When Roosevelt took office, he was worried about deficits of $15 billion. During the war, deficits grew to $110 billion and 110% of GDP. No one wants to incur debt, but it's a really good economic lesson to say, if we don't go down this path right now, where we borrow $2, maybe even $4 trillion, tack it on to the debt that we already owe, we might not have an economy to rescue in 6 months or 8 months from now. But the book also offers some insights into this particular issue. The general consensus is that the debt, for the time being, is manageable. So, fiscal policy criticisms and complications. Let's remember one important idea before we go over the criticisms. First, contractionary fiscal policy aimed at addressing demand pull inflation isn't used all that often because, number one, we don't actually experience demand pull inflation in the macroeconomic cycle all that frequently. Number two, the policy options of increasing taxes and or decreasing government spending aren't exactly popular, right? So when we talk about these criticisms, these are criticisms of expansionary fiscal stimulus. So the first criticism, what we call the timing problem, and it breaks down to the recognition lag, administrative lag, operational lag. Sometimes recessions creep up on us where we don't realize things are all that bad. So one criticism of the use of tax cuts and increasing government spending to address an economic downturn is that we don't recognize the problem until things have gotten bad. Now, in 2008, it was obvious the ceiling was collapsing. This COVID-19 coronavirus, it's more than obvious we have to do something. So this isn't always a legitimate criticism. The administrative lag is legit, right? So there's an old saying that it takes members of Congress, right, an hour and a half to watch 60 Minutes. That things that the wheels of government churn very slowly. Even this last $2 trillion fiscal stimulus passed by the federal government took an extra 4 or 5 days than it should have. Political squabbling, you have staffers trying to put things in a bill that aren't really related to what's going on, and somebody has a pet project they're trying to get paid for. It is disheartening and somewhat deplorable that the members of the House and the Senate don't necessarily always do what's in the best interest of the country by setting aside political differences during times of need. But ultimately, we got it done. So the administrative lag, it takes time to finally decide what we're going to do. The operational lag is an interesting point, right? And here's why it's interesting. When the federal government cuts taxes or increases spending, how long does it ultimately take to work its way into the economy? So, in 2008, when the economy went into significant, severe downturn, Bush was still in office. There was an initial fiscal stimulus package which sent $600 to every American. When Barack Obama took office after 2009, January, Barack Obama was inaugurated. There was another $787 billion worth of fiscal stimulus. The administrations took different approaches. The Bush approach was to give everyone $600 immediately. Barack Obama and his administration decided, let's give everyone incremental increases in their paycheck over time. So both have pros and cons, right? The all-at-once approach is kind of equivalent to saying, let's go for the bazooka. Let's hope that one big shot gets the economy up and running. The little incremental increase in disposable income, the idea is like, okay, it's sustainable over time. Either approach, you still have this operational lag. When the federal government passes a law, the tax cuts don't happen immediately and people don't get paychecks that day. And government spending may take some time, especially on infrastructure projects, to actually hit the economy. The political business cycle. Look, the only job of a politician is to get reelected. It is possible that elected officials may cut taxes and or increase in government spending just to make the economy look better prior to an election. This is a major problem, this third criticism, offsetting state and local financing. This happened during the 2008 recession, and it's happening to a huge extent when we look at the current situation in the U.S. economy with the COVID-19 downturn, right? So the federal government is permitted to cut taxes and increase government spending. The federal government is permitted to do so, right? But unfortunately, state governments don't have that luxury. State governments do not have that luxury, right? So when you think about what's taking place at the state level versus the federal level, right? We have this thing think of a rope where we're playing tug of war. The federal government is cutting taxes and increasing government spending to stimulate the economy. At the same time, state and local governments are looking for ways to cut spending and increase taxes. The state, New York is something like $8 billion in debt prior to the economic downturn caused by COVID, right? New York is in dire economic condition right now. New York's going to end up being 20-some billion dollars in debt. So New York is going to want to raise taxes and cut spending in any fashions they can because of this huge debt problem. At the same time, the federal government's sending checks to all kinds of businesses and making loans available and increasing government spending. So we have this offsetting of state and local financing. The federal government's pulling the rope one way, state and local governments are pulling it the other way. All right, let's talk about what's called the crowding out effect. The crowding out effect. Now, we will come back to this other idea in a moment. Net export effect, we will revisit that in a moment. But let's talk about what's called the crowding out effect as a criticism of fiscal stimulus. We looked at this graph in the previous slide. This is the graph of the domestic money market. On the vertical axis, we are measuring not what we call the price of money, but the domestic real interest rate. That's why it says I, interest rates. On the horizontal axis, it's simple, quantity. Quantity of money demanded and supplied. The vertical supply curve, the orange curve, at any point in time, the amount of money in circulation is fixed. The Federal Reserve controls our nation's money supply. Vertical supply of money. The demand for money, which we'll go over in much more detail when we cover monetary policy and banking, but obviously people need money to purchase goods and services. Now, we already identified the reality of what takes place as far as the federal budget deficit is concerned when we use fiscal stimulus or expansionary fiscal policy to address an economic downturn. The economy goes into recession, GDP drops, unemployment rises. The federal government steps in by slashing taxes and or increasing government spending, and most likely some combination of both. Cutting taxes, increasing government spending adds to the federal budget deficits. Right? Okay, we know that. So, to finance the deficit, to buy bonds, the government actually increases the demand for money. You see the shift in the demand curve, this rightward shift in the demand curve, pushing up interest rates from I1 to I2. We learned previously that there is a relationship between the real rate of interest in the economy and the expected rate of return on business projects, investment demand. We also know that when people buy things like homes and cars, higher interest rates stifle that type of spending. So this is what we mean by the crowding out effect. The government uses expansionary fiscal policy to stimulate the economy. Cut taxes, increase government spending. They increase the demand for money to finance the deficit. That increase in demand for money pushes up interest rates, which means that private sector spending may be negatively impacted because fewer business proposals will be profitable now that interest rates are higher because the expected rate of return on certain proposals does not exceed the new real rate of interest. Plus, consumers will purchase less cars, refinance their homes less frequently, less consumer spending. Now, two ideas here. Number one, and this is most important, the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, controls the nation's money supply. So, to offset the increase in interest rates, which would be caused by fiscal stimulus and the increase in demand for money, the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, can simply react by shifting the money supply to the right. And that's what happens, right? In other words, the Federal Reserve, our nation's central bank, can bring interest rates down by using monetary policy. Much more discussion on that later. Another question then is, okay, well, how much investment spending actually takes place during a recession anyway? Well, we know that during a recession, businesses don't find hardly any proposals all that, we'll say, interesting because it's nearly impossible to find a good business idea during a severe economic downturn where the rate of return is going to be greater than the real rate of interest. All right, one final idea. Perhaps the crowding out effect will only apply in the long run. In other words, we looked at that slide where we looked at the national debt and who owns the national debt. We talked about the national debt currently being $23.8 trillion. We talked about a huge addition to the national debt of at least $2 trillion and maybe more because of COVID-19 economic downturn, fiscal stimulus associated with this horrific virus, and more debt for the economy. There is a possibility that in the long run, longer period of time we're talking, there could be a crowding out effect because if the government continues to borrow, potential buyers of debt may see the federal government as more risky and demand a higher rate of interest to lend the money. That's a big if, but it could happen, right? If that happens, it would definitely crowd out some private investment. Now, the net export effect is really one of these interesting but somewhat challenging ideas to explain to students. So here we'll just do this quickly as possible, so at least you'll understand it step by step. All right, and if you follow this, it really demonstrates how much you've learned this semester in macroeconomics. So we know that exports are influenced by the exchange rate between the dollar and other currencies, right? So if the dollar appreciates, it makes U.S. exports more expensive to foreigners, right? So here's what happens. Recession, increased government spending, decreased taxes, expansionary fiscal policy taken on by the government to address the recession. If the economy is in a recession, GDP falling, unemployment rising, and the government uses expansionary fiscal policy, lower taxes and increase in government spending will increase the size of the deficit. To finance the deficit, the government increases the demand for money, pushes up interest rates. Here's the net export effect. Investors around the globe see interest rates in the United States rising and decide to take their monies and invest it in the United States, where interest rates are now relatively higher than in their domestic economy. Ceteris paribus. So if you live in Europe and you say, hey, look, the interest rate on a 10-year government bond in the United States, 2.5%. The interest rate on a euro bond, 1%. But if you live in Europe and you want to buy U.S. government debt, you have to what? Take your euros and exchange them for dollars. So higher interest rates in the U.S. caused by or a reaction to or one of the economic side effects of our deficit and increased government spending, lower taxes, right, means interest rates go up. Foreigners take their currencies. They want to invest them into U.S. debt. They exchange them for dollars, which increases demand for dollars. Increase in demand for dollars makes the dollar appreciate and makes exports more expensive, the net export effect. Now, obviously, that's a complicated concept, but if you follow the conversation, you've learned a ton this semester. Quick review of the crowding out effect so you can see the language along with the graph, right? So, economy is in a recession. Government decides to use expansionary fiscal stimulus, increase government spending, cut taxes, right? Therefore, the government must borrow, increase the size of the deficit. That's going to increase the demand for money, for funds, right? Which pushes up interest rates. Increase in interest rates means that investment project spending will fall because there are fewer projects where the expected rate of return is greater than the real rate of interest. Investment drops, and ultimately it would drop by a multiplied amount. Is there any way to predict what's going to happen to the economy? Members of the business community and economists identify what we call the leading economic indicators, and these are relatively decent at predicting or forecasting the economic future, right? So how many hours are people working weekly, the average work week? All right, this one's a big one. Initial claims for unemployment insurance. All right, this is crazy to say this, but over the last 2 weeks, this is April of 2020, we had 10 million people file for unemployment, the largest increase in the history in number terms. It's crazy to talk about these numbers. All right, new orders for consumer goods, especially durable goods, Vendor performance, new orders for capital goods, that's a big one. Equipment, tools, and such. Building permits is a big one. Construction is always a big part of the economy. There's a lot of trickle up effect of construction spending, multiplier effect of construction spending. Stock prices typically are a leading economic indicator. The stock market does better because the economy is doing better. That's a good sign. I mean, if you think about the value of a stock, the value of the price of the stock is really is theoretically the price of the stock is determined by the assets that the company owns, machines and land and trademarks and such, and right, the liabilities that they've incurred and like how much debt they incurred, right? So assets equals liabilities and owner's equity, and then the stock price is a reflection of the corporation's theoretical ability to generate profits moving forward. So it's discounted cash flow type of idea, right? So if stock prices are increasing, that theoretically means that the companies are doing well and that the shares are worth more because earnings are increasing. Now, there isn't always a direct correlation between stock prices and economic performance, right? It's a sort of a generalization. So there's always an exception to the rule. In 1987, we had a huge stock market decline, and believe it or not, one of the worst stock market declines, the worst since the Great Depression, and it didn't lead to a recession. It was kind of an interesting time period. But generally speaking, stock prices. All right, money supply. A lot of people look and see what the Fed's doing with the money supply, and that will sort of be a leading economic indicator. We're definitely going to cover monetary policy moving forward. Interest rate spread. Okay, so this one is mostly mildly complicated, but you should be able to follow this idea. Those people in the world of finance, economic, and business look at the spread between 2-year Treasury yields and 10-year Treasury yields. So what a 10-year Treasury bond is yielding, the interest rate on a 10-year Treasury bond, and what a 2-year Treasury bond is yielding, and the spread between them, right? So think about this logically. If you're going to let an institution borrow your money, if you're going to let an institution borrow your money for 2 years, you wouldn't expect as high as an interest rate as you would if you're going to let that same institution borrow your money for 10 years. You're taking on more risk if you're allowing the institution to borrow money for 10 years. For two reasons: there's a longer period of time, they might not pay you back, so there's a higher default risk. Plus, inflation could erode the purchasing power of the loan you made, right? The money you're getting paid back. So, typically speaking, the interest rate on 2-year government bonds is lower than 10-year government bonds. There are times when the yield curve, the relationship between the 2-year and 10-year, gets inverted, where interest rates on 2-year government bonds is actually higher than 10-year government bonds. When that happens, it usually means we're heading to a recession. Right? The last one, simple to explain: consumer expectations, which simply says the Michigan study measures how confident consumers are in the health and well-being of their financial and economic situation. We follow that. This concludes the fiscal policy video. Look forward to other macroeconomic videos.